Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving headfirst into a really provocative YouTube video. It features someone known as Prof. PLO.
Right.
And the title itself.
Right.
Prof. PLO drops a bombshell, shakes coward leaders, supporting Captain Traore. Well, it hints at the directness, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It's very critical commentary on governance, on leadership across African nations.
Yeah, and we've had several of you reach out, kind of curious to understand the core of his message. So that's exactly what we're going to try and unpack for you today.
Absolutely. In this video, it really doesn't shy away from tackling some, fundamental challenges facing many African countries.
Like what specifically?
Well, we're talking about everything from the sort of historical baggage of colonial era systems to the present day realities of democratic practice, leadership issues, and that persistent problem of corruption.
Gotcha.
So our goal is to go beyond just a summary, really dissect his arguments, look at the examples he uses, and ultimately understand why his perspective seems to be striking such a chord.
Okay, let's get right into it then. One of the foundational points Prof. PLO makes is this strong critique of the governmental systems adopted at independence.
Right. He brings in the historian John Henrik Clarke here.
Yeah, emphasizing that these weren't systems that grew organically from African traditions, but were, inherited wholesale from the colonizers.
And what's really interesting there is the argument underneath it all. He's not just saying, this happened historically. No, he's suggesting these imported systems might just be inherently ill-suited, for the diverse social, cultural, political landscapes in Africa.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like they were designed for somewhere else for different reasons.
Exactly. And maybe they were always going to struggle to truly take root and foster effective governance. And this seems to be a key reason why he hesitates to just use the word democracy without qualifying it.
Right. Suggesting a disconnect between the ideal and the reality on the ground.
Precisely.
He then paints a rather unsettling picture of the current governance landscape, doesn't he?
He does. He lists quite a few countries: Sudan, Somalia, DRC, the Sahel region, Guinea-Bissau, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, even Gabon.
And points to this recurring issue of coups, which, just for clarity, means coups, right? Or attempted power grabs.
Yes, exactly. Coups. And if you look at that list, a pattern of political instability becomes pretty apparent across different regions. Now, obviously, each situation has its own unique factors, but he's drawing attention to a broader trend, something suggesting, underlying weaknesses in their governance structures.
But he does mention exceptions.
He does offer Botswana and Namibia as potential outliers. He acknowledges their track record of successful elections. But the emphasis is definitely on the more troubled nations, highlighting his concern that maybe these democratic successes are the exception, not the rule.
Then he zooms in quite a bit on Kenya, which seems to be a real focus for him.
Yes, definitely.
And he makes this fascinating observation about Kenyan leaders. He suggests their true identities, specifically tribal affiliations, come out most clearly, not informal political speeches.
No, but when they're speaking their mother tongues at funerals back in their home communities. So Bianas, Maragoli, Maasai, Kamba, Kikuyu, those identities surface then.
That's a really interesting point about the interplay between national and ethnic identity in politics there.
It is. He's basically suggesting that while you have political parties and national platforms, these deeper loyalties, these identities, might still be rooted firmly in tribal affiliations.
Raising questions about political mobilization and, whether national unity really gets past those ethnic divisions in practice.
Exactly. It raises fundamental questions.
And then he uses that pretty blunt analogy. The forest change, but the monkeys remain the same.
Yeah, it's quite cynical, isn't it, about political transitions? It implies that leaders might come and go, regimes might change.
But the basic problems just persist.
The fundamental issues, the behaviors within the system, they just stay the same. And he extends this skepticism to the political opposition, too.
How so?
He suggests they aren't necessarily offering anything new, not a fresh perspective or different values. Often, he says, they're just former government figures driven by the same, his words, insatiable greed for power.
Wow. So it paints a picture of a closed shop politically, where real change is hard to come by no matter who's officially in charge.
That seems to be his view, yeah, elusive change and accountability.
He doesn't hold back on the voters either, does he? Expressing frustration that Kenyans repeatedly elect what he calls unelectable individuals.
No, he doesn't. He even throws in that quote attributed to Einstein about electing comedians and the palace becoming a circus. It's quite pointed.
It certainly is.
And it reflects this deep concern about leadership quality and what actually influences people's choices at the ballot box.
Which leads to that question he poses.
What is the value of knowing that which is right without doing that which is right?
Yeah, that really cuts to the heart of it.
It does. He's pointing to what he sees as a gap between, understanding the problems and actually having the political will or maybe the capacity to implement real solutions.
He then gets into the specifics of the Kenyan Constitution and devolution. He mentions he was involved in the drafting.
Right, and refers to the Buluma's draft.
And notes several recommendations that didn't make it into the final version, like Nairobi not being a county and suggesting way fewer counties like 14 to 18 instead of the 47 they ended up with.
And this gives a really interesting sort of insider's view, doesn't it, on those constitutional debates and why he thinks certain decisions were, misguided.
His concern about the 47 counties being financially unsustainable seems key.
It's a critical point, especially when you compare Kenya's economy size, its GDP, to other countries. Think about the USA, Nigeria, India, China, South Africa.
Much bigger economies, some of them.
Right, bigger GDPs, but they often operate with significantly fewer states or provinces. The U.S. has 50 states, but its economy is vastly larger.
So supporting 47 governors, deputy governors, all that administrative structure, it puts a potential strain on a smaller economy.
That's the implication, yes. It raises real questions about efficiency and cost effectiveness.
And his conclusion from that is pretty stark. He says, despite prayers and fasting, nothing is going to change until we change.
Yeah, emphasizing that need for internal transformation, not just relying on, external factors or interventions.
Which really underscores that theme of agency, both citizens and leaders needing to take responsibility.
Definitely. And from there, he pivots to corruption, which he describes in really strong terms.
He says leaders seem unmoved and untouched by accusations.
Yeah, he describes this almost theatrical scene, accused individuals escorted by crowds to the anti-corruption offices.
Only to give press conferences afterwards.
Exactly. Effectively normalizing what he calls, quote, the most profitable business in Kenya today.
That's a harsh assessment.
It is. And his frustration with the apparent impunity is really palpable when he points to the visible wealth of some leaders, wealth that just doesn't seem to square with their official salaries.
It highlights a massive challenge to accountability.
And the rule of law, yeah. And the impact isn't abstract. He talks about the deterioration of public services like local dispensaries.
Right, the concrete effects on ordinary people.
And then the criticism of leaders jetting off abroad for medical care while the local healthcare system struggles. It just underlines that disconnect he sees.
He even mentions a specific figure, though it sounds almost unbelievable. Alleged 13.3 billion shillings a month in bribes collected by police.
It's a staggering number. And look, figures like that are often incredibly hard to verify precisely.
Sure.
But the fact that claims like this circulate publicly just reinforces his main point about how pervasive he believes corruption is across different sectors.
Which then leads him to another factor he sees as a major obstacle: tribalism.
Yes, he makes a direct appeal to young Kenyans here,
urging them to choose consciously between tribal identity and a unified Kenyan identity, suggesting tribes should be for, cultural stuff only.
Right. Relegated to cultural reasons, not political ones. And he quotes Samora Machel, doesn't he? If the new African nation is to thrive, the tribe must die.
In the context of national decision-making, yeah.
It really shows how strongly he believes that prioritizing tribal loyalties in political life undermines building a cohesive nation-state.
And the example he gives? Voters being swayed by small amounts of money based on tribe.
Yeah, it illustrates the practical impact, how ethnic identity can be, manipulated for political gain, often hurting broader national interests.
Okay, next target. The Kenyan parliament.
He characterizes them as having an insatiable appetite for our taxes.
And being the best paid in the world relative to GDP, that's a strong indictment.
It definitely paints a picture, doesn't it? A legislature maybe more focused on its own interests than the public's.
And his skepticism about the CDF, the Constituency Development Fund.
Yeah, he's very skeptical. He suggests it's less about public benefit and more a way for politicians to enrich themselves, through business deals in their own constituencies.
Which ties into the broader criticism about politicians becoming millionaires so quickly after getting into office.
Exactly. It reinforces that perception of self-interest being the main driver.
And the push to put CDF in the Constitution, even after courts ruled against it.
That really seems to frustrate him. He basically attributes it to politicians thinking the public has
short memories.
His phrase was, memory of a mosquito and a water combined.
Wow.
Yeah. And he ends that part with a clear call for citizens to start making demands, real demands, of their leaders.
That emphasis on civic engagement keeps coming back.
It's crucial to his whole argument. He's not just blaming leaders, he's saying the citizens have a responsibility too, which then leads him to think about democracy itself.
Right. He argues that the democracy practiced in many African nations today is essentially a neo-colonial version.
Inherited, again, from the colonizers. He contrasts this with the original Greek idea and also Lincoln's definition, government of, by, and for the people.
And he even brings up the Mandan Charter of 1235.
Yes, as an example of pre-colonial systems of order and governance in Africa.
So challenging the idea that democracy is purely a Western import.
Exactly, suggesting Africa had its own traditions long before Europeans arrived, and his idea of the ghost of mimicry is really powerful here.
Explain that a bit more.
He argues that many African nations are still just imitating the structures, the symbols of their former colonial powers. British systems in Kenya, French and former French colonies, Portuguese in theirs.
And this mimicry might be holding back the development of truly local, effective systems.
That's his argument, that it hinders finding governance models that actually fit.
And he gives concrete examples of this mimicry.
Yeah, things like parliamentary procedures, Mr. Speaker, sir, the formal attire, the wool robes for judges and speakers, totally unsuited to the climate often.
And the title's His Excellency, the Right Honorable.
All of it paints a picture of institutions still heavily shaped by those colonial traditions, maybe more in form than in substance that's relevant today.
Which he argues might be preventing a real rethinking of governance.
A reimagining of structures that are genuinely aligned with African needs and contexts today. And this sets up his big call to action, aimed especially at the youth.
Yes, he speaks directly to the younger generation, urges them to speak a different language, to actively work to change mindsets.
And he shares that personal story, doesn't he? About growing up in Jericho and not even being aware of tribal distinctions, suggesting maybe things weren't always this way. Then he lays out those three categories of people, drawing from Greek ideas, he says.
Right, the idiots, tribalists, and citizens.
And his definition of idiots is, well, provocative. Educated people who don't hold their representatives accountable.
Contrasting them with tribalists focused only on ethnic loyalty.
And then citizens, those who prioritize the well-being of the whole nation, Kenya in this case, for everyone, for future generations, wanting good services, opportunities.
And his call is crystal clear. Be citizens of the Republic of Kenya first.
Yeah, with the idea that being a good Kenyan citizen naturally leads to being a good citizen of Africa and the world.
He circles back to leaders' self-interest near the end, too.
Reminding them, or maybe reminding the audience, of the fate of past autocratic leaders. Mobutu, Bokassa, Bongo, Duvalier, the Assads.
He uses that incredibly cutting phrase about a leader being our thief.
Yeah, that phrase. It sounds resigned, cynical maybe, but it really just highlights how urgent he sees the need for change.
And the final thought is about intergenerational responsibility.
Yes, leaving a note of hope, perhaps, suggesting the struggle for better governance is ongoing. It needs commitment from generation after generation.
Okay, so to kind of wrap it all up, Prof. PLO in this video gives this really impassioned, very sharp critique of governance and society, mainly focused on Kenya, but with broader implications.
Definitely. He's challenging that long shadow of inherited colonial systems.
Expressing deep worry about leadership quality, corruption.
Highlighting how tribalism divides people.
And making a really strong call for citizens to engage differently, to move beyond just mimicking Western democratic models.
Absolutely. And listening to this deep dive into his commentary, it really raises some critical questions for you, the listener, to think about.
Like, how do these historical systems still shape things today?
Yeah, and what are the biggest roadblocks to getting effective, accountable leadership? How can that influence of ethnic divisions be tackled constructively?
And fundamentally, what does it really mean to be an active, responsible citizen in this kind of context?
Yeah, all important questions.
Which brings us to our final thought for you to ponder. Considering Prof. PLO's analysis, all the issues he raises, what single, concrete action do you believe could spark the most significant positive change in governance in the countries he's talking about?
It's a huge question, no easy answers.
It's definitely complex, but hopefully this deep dive has given you some valuable perspectives to consider as you think about it. Thanks for joining us.